Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed regions and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education for Winebow Fine Wine and Spirits. And I'm going to be your co-host today, but your real host is TJ Griffin, Certified Bordeaux Educator. TJ Griffin has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality, the wholesale, and throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and then sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys the privilege of doing what he loves full time. And now here to discuss today's topic, Sauternes. TJ Griffin.
Hey, Ron.
Hey there.
How are you today?
I'll send you an apology letter for that terrible introduction. I'll do better next time.
All right. We can't hit a home run every time is what I
seem to read my own typing there. It's not even my own writing. I can't even read the typing. It's terrible.
Need a new font.
I guess.
Yeah, so today we're going to continue our exploration of the 6 families of Bordeaux. Last time we've had a long break, about a month, because there was a vacation in there around the 4th. So if you remember last time we were talking about the Grave area in Pessac-les-Oignons, and we did not want to talk about the sweet wines because it gets a little confusing and it deserves its own episode. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
That, and we had already taken an hour on the Grave. So
yes, we don't want to take up too much of people's time, as much as I enjoy this. So this is the region overall is sort of known as the Sauternes, and it's the southern part of the Grave. So here we are along the left bank of the Garonne River, and there's also another river that comes through called the Cérons, and that confluence of that little macro climate there between those two rivers causes a unique phenomenon, which we'll talk about a little bit in depth in a few slides. So you see the map there. This is from Bordeaux.com, and we see Pessac-les-Oignons and Grave, but we're going to hide those. I'm not going to talk in depth. Well, I'm not going to talk at all actually about Grave Supérieur because we did mention it last time. It's a part of the Grave that is allowed to produce sweet and botrytized wine. So we're really just going to focus on the last 3 here: Cérons, Barsac, and Sauternes. But we have to talk about this fungus, Botrytis cinerea, aka noble rot. The French word for that is pourriture noble, noble rot. Now, what is it? It kind of looks gross, Ron. It doesn't look like something that you would want to then make into wine.
No, that would be used out of desperation, like many of the things we now call high cuisine that are originally like, you're going to eat that? Are you sure you're going to eat that?
Yeah, I was watching a program once about the differences between like Western and Eastern cuisine, and some of the things that like they don't mind in Eastern cuisine are a lot of fermented things that we think are in the West. We think, oh, I would never eat that. But then they look at stuff like us that we eat, particularly moldy things like cheeses and stuff, and they say, well, I would never eat that. So it depends on your frame of reference, I guess.
What if we covered it with koji instead?
Yes.
Let's put kojikin on it. Then we'll make miso. Oh, okay.
Aha. So noble rot versus gray rot. They are actually both botrytis. And botrytis is not just in grapes. It affects lots of different fruits and plants. And what happens is it's in the vineyard. It's a fungus that's in the vineyard. It can hide in many, many, many places, and you would probably never be able to get rid of it even if you tried. What happens, it happens in humid areas. So in this particular area, you have this mist that covers the vineyards at dawn and is there for the morning hours. Now, if it stays like that, you're going to have a problem with gray rot, which is also known as bunch rot, and that is not good. You can't use the grapes. You could, if you really wanted to be, if you had no choice, there's things you can do in the winery, but it's really laborious and time consuming and expensive to try to save them. So most of the time, if that happens, it's a total loss. But what happens if it becomes sunny and dry later in the day? We can get the conditions for noble rot. So this is it's a fungus. It covers the grape. It's called a necrotrophic fungus, which is from the Greek word nekros, meaning corpse. So it kills its host in order to propagate itself. So a little short-sighted, but I guess it has a good time while it's doing it. And it covers the grapes, and then it shoots these little hyphae, or singular hypha, which is a little filament into the grape. Now, this is where it gets really interesting and sort of sciencey, if you'll bear with me. The reason that it doesn't, the grape loses its ability to regulate its own hydration at this point. So the fungus has changed the metabolism of the grape. And the reason that all of the good stuff, all the juice and stuff doesn't come out necessarily is because there's osmotic, there's an osmotic difference, osmotic gradient, a high osmotic gradient. So an osmotic gradient is the difference between the concentration of the solutions on the outside and the inside. So the inside is so concentrated that it just stays there. And what happens is the grapes become dehydrated, basically, concentrating all of the sugars, all of those flavors, all of the acid too. That's what people don't realize. You're not losing acid, you're actually concentrating the acid. So as the sugar goes up, so does the acidity, which so that balances, which is what you want. And then in addition, the botrytis, the fungus itself, adds its own sort of particular aromas and flavors, which we'll talk about later. And you get this really intensely flavored, aromatic, concentrated, delicious grape that, again, I don't think I would want to eat one because it would be a little weird, but when you make it into wine, it can be really delicious. And again, if you have that conditions where it just doesn't become sunny, then the grape loses all ability to dehydrate and just falls apart.
So TJ,
yes,
a lot of dessert wines in the Mediterranean basin especially are made just from shriveled grapes, right?
Right.
So maybe help the audience understand the difference in the resulting juice between things that are raisinated just by dehydration and the raisination, for lack of a better description, that happens here through the influence of botrytis.
Yeah, so it's these are late harvest. I mean, they are concentrated. They are, if there was no fungus, they would start to raisinate pretty soon. We're not quite at that raisinate stage, but they're becoming nice and concentrated. And this is sort of, I wouldn't say it's artificial because it's very natural, but it's a different way of dehydrating grapes. So you're still getting that same concentration of all the good stuff. Like I said, the aromatic compounds, the flavor compounds, the sugars, and the acidity at a sort of elevated pace. And you're getting this additionally, what you don't have in raisinated grapes is the effect on the flavors and aromas and flavors of the fungus itself. You do get, there you can detect in certain botrytized wines even just a hint of mold. And I know that sounds terrible, but it's there in a not unpleasant way. But it also adds things, its own sort of unique aromas and flavors. Things like saffron is attributed to the mold itself. Some say ginger is, not from the grape concentration, but the mold itself. So it adds its own unique profile that you wouldn't see in a concentrated grape. And you can kind of see that best, I think. What do you think about this? Maybe in Germany, when you have the different levels of ripeness, when you get through Spätlese, late harvest, to Auslese, and then you start to get into the Beerenauslese and Trockenbeerenauslese, where you start to have botrytis affected grapes. And you can really see the difference between, okay, this is sweet and a purity of fruit. Now this is sweet with a little something else.
Yeah, I think the other side, the other magic for me, which you're hitting upon, but I'm just going to fully expose it, is that
Sure.
Pick up a raisin and eat it, right? You don't ever think of raisins as tart, sweet, molasses kind of flavors, rich. The magic of botrytis is what you brought up, is that wines that are made from fully botrytis affected grapes are going to have a naturally higher acidity going into fermentation than anything made out of pasteurizage or natural raisination, because that metabolic process is dropping acidity while it becomes a raisin, like it's going out of style, in exchange for raising the sugar level of the grape per milliliter of juice, so to speak. So, whether you're talking about Chenin Blanc, which I think exposes it really, really well in the Loire Valley, and yes, definitely if you tasted through a producer's range of ripeness levels from the Mosel, for instance, and got to Trockenbeerenauslese or Beerenauslese, you would definitely start to see that now, okay, now I'm getting the honey, now I'm getting the saffron, now I'm getting the exotic spices, and there's a purity there because most of those wines don't see any new wood. Whereas we're going to talk about different winemaking practices here. So cool. I think we've probably killed that dead horse multiple times. So I'll just be quiet and let you move on.
Yeah, and interestingly, we know a lot about wine and wine history. We really don't know. We don't have any definitive start date of when somebody said, I just made wine from botrytis grapes, but it goes back farther than I thought. They think at least to the 1500s, people were able, they knew how to make wine from botrytis grapes. And it was all over Western Europe. You have it in France. You mentioned Loire. We're talking about Bordeaux today. In Germany, of course, in Austria, famously in Hungary, in Tokai. And now you can have botrytis wines all over the world. But this is really, this sort of Western Europe in the humid areas is where you got the birthplace of this.
I still hold true to the idea that it was an act of desperation at some point when they had no choice because weather gave them bad mojo, and they were like, well, still have to have wine. Let's see how it turns out.
Yeah, somebody just said, I am so tired of throwing away these. I'm just going to try to make wine, see what happens. And maybe was pleasantly surprised. So it's a very, why is Sauternes, Barsac, and other botrytis wines so expensive? And here's one of the reasons why. Because noble rot is fickle and it does not attack the grapes equally. So you might have a bunch of grapes. I don't know how many grapes are in a bunch. I don't know, say 30. Does that sound right to you? 30-ish? 24, something like that. You might have one or two that are affected fully by botrytis. You might have a couple more that are starting to get affected by botrytis. So what you have is you're going through the vineyard multiple times. In French, they call these trees, trees successives. And you can see here, this is from the Sauternes Barsac website. The harvest can last up to 3 months, and you can go through 3 to 5 times, on average. That's just for an average Sauternes house. I think it was the 74 vintage for Château de Cem, which we'll talk about in a minute, the granddaddy of all Sauternes Chateau. In the 1974 vintage, they went through something like 11 times trying to get the best grapes. And in the end, after they made the wine, they threw it away. They decided not to release it because it just wasn't good. And that's the problem with botrytis as well. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. It's not a science. It's as much an art as it is a science, if anything. So you're going through multiple times, selecting only the best, most affected grapes each time. You're being very careful handling, very, delicate handling, slow pressing and settling, and then you make it as you would normally. But there is the necessity of SO2. We're talking about this is rot, this is mold. So you have to be aware of that. There's a lot of potential for volatile acidity. And there's also with sweet wine, you don't want it re-fermenting once it's bottled. So SO2 addition is necessary with these wines. Sauternes is the most famous of the appellations. along with the, Barsac. Barsac is actually one of the communes in Sauternes, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But Sauternes really where it's most strongly associated with. And this botrytized wine, like I said, it's all over the place. But I think if you say, name a wine affected by noble rot, one of the first things people say is Sauternes. It's the most famous. It's very respected. It was actually classified at the same time as the Médoc in 1855. There's one chateau that's Premier Cru Classé, which is Château Cérons, and then there's several that are second and third, three. Well, we'll talk about that when we get to classifications. But was recognized a long time ago as producing very superior wines. And if you are in this appellation and you produce a dry white wine, it is just called Bordeaux Blanc. You can only call sweet botrytized wine Sauternes. And there's all kinds of rules, including a minimum how many tries you have to go through each vineyard. So that is regulated by law as well. This is, was famous for a long time, and you had a couple of the big chateaux that really kept the reputation going. But then you had a lot of really kind of mass-produced sweet wines from the Grave that hurt the reputation of the entire area. And just like the Grave, that turned around in the 80s, and now Sauternes is bigger and badder than ever. And there we go. There's a picture of Sauternes. You can kind of get a hint of the weather here. I tried to find the pic. I believe this is from their website. This kind of shows you that, you want a little cloudy, a little mist, a little dark weather. And that's why also, Ron, when we talk about vintages, which we will have an upcoming episode just devoted to vintages, a good vintage in Bordeaux can mean very different things. It could be a good vintage for the left bank. It could be a good vintage for the right bank. It could be a good vintage for white wines. It could be a good vintage for botrytized wines. A good vintage is generally not uniform for everybody. Somebody's not having the best vintage, even in the best years.
Totally. And, we have a question in from Ken. Do you mind taking it now?
Oh, sure.
So do the vintners use the grapes that are not affected by noble rot to make regular white wine?
Yes, I believe that, but that's a choice that's made early on because, and you might they know their vineyards, right? So they know, and they know how to read the vintage. So you're going to see like, okay, this part of the vineyard just doesn't get great botrytis. I'm going to make my house white wine for here from this part of the vineyard. But because if you wait, it's a little too late, right? But for the most part, most of the production for the best areas in these communes go for botrytized wine. Famously considered the best dry white wine of the area is also made by Château Cérons called Château Y, which is also quite expensive. But so there is devoted vineyard parcels. There are devoted, grapes and areas and rows that are for that. But the main focus here is for the botrytized wines. Is that your understanding, Ron?
Yeah, because once you have to decide before you start playing the game of will botrytis happen or not, what you're going to do. Because once you go down the path of I'm trying to get botrytis, dry wine's out the door because botrytis affected dry wine is kind of weird at best. And so this is an intentional decision making. It's a little different, honestly, than what happens in Germany, right? Because in Germany, they might harvest all of the various styles from one vineyard, where they start off, they pick some Cabernet, then they pick some Spätlese, then they pick some Auslese, and then they say, okay, let's see what happens. And maybe they get to Beerenauslese, but not Trockenbeerenauslese. But that's not the way Bordeaux really works. And some of it's the laws, like, okay, I'm going to have to dedicate this vineyard to hand harvest. I'm going to have to dedicate it to at least 3 tree through the vineyard to collect the botrytis grapes. Sure, there's a possibility that they could sell off some of the lesser infected fruit to lower quality sweet wine production in the end, which may happen. And I would say it probably does happen. But no, it's not one of those like, well, we'll just use these unaffected botrytis grapes to make our dry wine. No, that's not reality.
Yeah, and that's again why it's why these wines are expensive, because you're gambling. you're gambling, in a smart way, you kind of know what you're doing, but you are taking a chance every vintage. Couple more facts about Sauternes. Pre-phylloxera, Sauvignon Blanc was the more important grape, and now, of course, it is Semillon. So the big grapes are, of course, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, Muscadel, and to a small degree, Sauvignon Gris is allowed, but that's all that's allowed. But Semillon is the majority of the wines, whereas if you flip it for the dry white wines, Sauvignon Blanc is usually the majority. And it's important to point out the drinkability window for these wines is huge, Ron. You can have these wines young. You can have these wines with several years of age. You can have, the best wines decades after they've been released. So it's an impressive wine in that regard. That you can drink it at many different stages in its life, and it's still very, very enjoyable.
Indeed. And just a note about the reason for the switch to Semillon, I can't go back and look at their mindset, but it has proven over time that Semillon is more susceptible to botrytis. It blossoms better with botrytis. The skins aren't as thick. And so it was a natural move for an area known for sweet wines when they were having to replant, instead of tearing up vineyards that were functional just to get some more Semillon, they had an opportunity to intentionally go to more Semillon. So that may have been part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the grape itself that's very interesting, because if you think about the dry Semillon wines of Australia, in their youth, they're kind of innocuous and lemony and high acid and, moderate to low alcohol, but there's not a ton of complexity apparent in the grape. And then in a few years, these things start to develop that come out with age, like this toasty, almost woody, oaky note. There's no oak, in these wines generally, but it develops that waxy texture, and that's within a handful of years. So imagine in bottle after botrytized grapes aging for decades, how that can evolve too. So I think there's something there that they recognized early on without quite knowing what it was or why it was, that said, hey, when we have more Semillon in these wines, this is what happens. So I suspect that's sort of an educated guess. Château d'Yquem, which was once ordered by one of my customers when I was a young sales rep. He wanted a case of Château de Yquem. So he apparently hadn't heard of this, one of the most famous chateaus and wine properties in all over the world. And this is I don't know if you would agree with this, David. This is how one of the Bordeaux experts put it. In almost every wine region in the world, you can argue about who's the best producer, but not this one. Everyone pretty much agrees it's Château d'Yquem, which is and apparently I haven't been there, but it's up on a hill, kind of overlooking the rest of the area. So it knows who it is. This is royalty.
Yeah, I would agree. There's no argument in the concept of Sauternes. Who's best?
Who's best? And there's a lot of good Sauternes, but Château d'Yquem is considered and widely acknowledged by everybody as the best. And they charge a lot of money for their wines. They put a lot of work into their wines. They will famously not release in a vintage if they don't think it's up to their standards. They will release, they'll sell it off. So they have very high quality standards. They know who they are. They know their reputation. It has a long history. It was early on owned by King of England. It was also, I think, like the Duke of Aquitaine at the time. It's now owned by the LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy Corporation, and managed, I believe, by Pierre Lurton, who also manages Cheval Blanc in Saint-Emilion. So is used to managing very, very top chateau. Château La Tour Blanche is again, I'm not going to go through every chateau in the classification because we don't have that kind of time, but Château La Tour Blanche is one of the more respected of the Sauternes Chateau, very close to Chateau d'Yquem back in the day in terms of reputation. And it was actually donated to the French government and is a viticultural school, as well as being one of the top producing chateau in the area, which is very interesting. They created the school in 1911. And there's a wine, Ron, that you may be familiar with. This is a second wine from La Tour Blanche called Emotions de la Tour Blanche, primarily Semillon with some Sauvignon Blanc and Muscadel, that is imported and distributed by us at Winebow. So we get to have their second wine. So it's, as with any second wine in Bordeaux, it's usually younger parcels, and you're usually getting a lighter, more straightforward version of the house wine that they're famous for, but it's also tremendously less expensive. For example, this Emotions de la Tour Blanche gives you a taste of the chateau for around, depending on your market, around $36 retail for $750, not a $375, for $750.
Yeah, that's significantly not the price of.
Yes, significantly.
But you're right. It comes across differently. It's not from 100% of botrytis affected grapes. It's definitely lighter weight, but it is highly useful and quite representative of the greater majority of the appellation, for sure.
Well, I think $36 is not not inexpensive, but it's not so expensive that if you really, hey, I really want to have some Sauternes this weekend with whatever, we'll talk about food and wine pairing in a minute, but my chicken and waffles, you're not going to go get d'Yquem or La Tour Blanche or any of the other classified gross, but you can get a bottle of this and enjoy it very much without feeling like, oh, wow, I just spent a lot of money.
Well, I'm not going to go shopping for those, but I've met a few people who would do that because they don't have the same dollar for dollar ratio of value that I do. Their bank accounts are different.
Château Cérons is another famous chateau.
This one's owned by the band Genesis, right?
Oh, Sussudio. Is that Phil Collins? Sussudio? Is that what you're referencing?
That was, yes.
I always found this very difficult to pronounce because it's Cérons. So there's a we in there in the middle that I find hard to say quickly, but
I find all French words difficult to pronounce.
Yes, they can be. Very famous chateau in Sauternes, now owned by AXA Millésime, which also owns, for example, Pichon Baron and Pauillac, but owns several of the big chateaus. And this is also a very famous and well-respected chateau in Sauternes. And now Barsac. Barsac is one of the communes in Sauternes, but it also is allowed to call itself by Barsac. So if you own a chateau in this appellation, you can call your wine Barsac, or you can call it Sauternes. Most choose the more recognizable Sauternes for marketing purposes. It's a lot easier to understand, but some are proud of their appellation and will just go with Barsac. Historically, the wines were supposedly a little drier in Barsac, and there's a couple of terroir differences here that we'll talk about, but from what I understand, I haven't done an in-depth side-by-side tasting. I have tasted both, Sauternes and Barsac side by side, some of the best producers, including at that Bordeaux tasting not too long ago, but I'm not exhaustive in my tasting. But according to the true experts, there's virtually no difference. You can't say this is a Barsac style and this is a Sauternes style. They're too, their differences are too muddled at this point. Just like in Sauternes, if you choose to make a dry wine, it is just a Bordeaux Blanc. Some terroir differences. Sauternes is a little hillier, which that increases the effects of that mist that we get botrytis from. So in theory, Sauternes wines are more richly botrytized wines than Barsac. Again, saying that historically lighter. And Barsac is flatter. and has more sand and limestone soils. So in theory, more elegantly flavored wines. That's the theory behind it. Is that true? I don't know. There's Barsac. Château Clémence, one of the most popular producers in Barsac. It was very closely considered very close to Château d'Yquem in quality back in the day at the classification. This has been owned by the Lurton family for several decades, since 1971, and is still owned by them and run by them. Very classic chateau look there. Château Coutet, not to be confused. Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to say, and both of these producers, having had the privilege of selling them from the 70s vintages in the late 90s and 2000s, they age really well. They're classic, and they don't quite cost you the painful price tag of Yquem. Although Yquem still stands a smidge above them in my tasting experiences, these are well worth searching out.
Yeah, like we've talked about in other appellations throughout this series, is the price difference between the very, very top chateau and maybe the next tier down is huge, whereas the quality difference may not be as big. Yes, Château d'Yquem is acknowledged as the best, but it's so much pricier than these chateaux, and maybe you're getting a better value here with some of these wines. Château Coutet, there's also a Château Coutet in Saint-Emilion. Very confusing, but in Saint-Emilion they say Coutet. They just say Coutet here in Barsac. This is was owned by the Roland family for many years, and now is owned by the Bali family. And it is famous for having the longest cellars in the appellation, 110-meter cellars, which are apparently very, very impressive to see. I haven't been there, so I can't speak for it personally. This was one of the wines that Thomas Jefferson, he thought that their wines were the best in the Barsac appellation when he visited back in the day. This is a nice infographic. It is in French, but this is from the Sauternes Barsac website. They did not include Cérons in their website, so it's just Sauternes and Barsac. It's a nice infographic. It tells you some information. You get the two appellations, Sauternes and Barsac, from the 5 villages. There you see where they're located. This is something we're going to talk about in just a couple of slides, around 50 aromas, which I find ambitious, to say the least, but we'll talk about that. But this is on their website, and I will show you the website at the end. But first, I want to talk about Cérons. We can't let it go by without mentioning Cérons. It is made up of 3 villages, 3 communes: Cérons, Poronsac, and Ilat, just north of Barsac. They can make sweet white wines under the Cérons appellation, or they can make dry white and red Grave, and that's what most of the producers do here. However, that is starting to change slightly. There's a nice shot of a vineyard in Cérons. You see the hilliness there, and this is a good picture to look at, because you have to imagine, Ron, as the mists are settling down these little hills. This isn't a huge hill, but they're going to settle in different pockets here. So you're going to have, that's why you have that botrytis affecting different areas differently at different times, and in different intensity too. This area is thought to have the potential to be up with the other communes in the area that are in Sauternes, but it just never really had the investment, and that's starting to change, as we've talked about again in many of our webinars. If you're going to go, where are you going to go? You're not going to buy an existing property in Sauternes, but you might buy a property in Cérons and try to elevate it. So we should see some really interesting things coming from this appellation in the next decade or two. The botrytis does develop a little less reliably here in Sauternes, so they are gambling a little bit more, which is why a lot of producers will just say, I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm going to make a nice Grave wine. But as I said, we will see. We will see what happens as investment increases here.
Just a quick observation on that slide. If you flip back real quick, notice to the left out there in the audience, there's a giant willow tree and its offshoots. And, just as an indication of available moisture, willows will not grow unless there's like almost a river running through the ground. So this vineyard site is reflective of a generous water supply, or that tree wouldn't be there.
I didn't know that. I didn't know you were a tree expert.
I'm not, but we have a willow in our backyard, and basically a creek runs through it. And one of the reasons it's planted there and used in landscaping, I am told by people who do this, is that it's a great water absorber. So if you are on land that's holding water, you will often plant willow trees or similar trees that suck it up. And if you notice, most of them are growing next to a pond or creek or something like that out in nature.
Now that I think of it, that's true. There's a few chateaux here. This isn't the greatest picture, but it looks like a beautiful property. Château Cérons is, it has the name of the appellation. It's generally acknowledged as maybe the top producer in the area. They have 30 hectares of vines on gravel soil with limestone subsoil, and they produce, of course, red Grave, dry white Grave, and a sweet botrytized Cérons. So this was an interesting infographic from their website. They claim 50 aromas, and they sort of divide them up in these 6 families. So I'm not going to read them all. Everyone can read their own. But I did want to point out some stuff. Again, saffron, I've been told, is not from the grapes themselves. It's a byproduct of the mold. One of the favorite words that the Brits use when they describe the smell of a botrytized wine, particularly Sauternes, is marmalade. You get that sort of tart, jammy, almost savory undercurrent underneath that fruit. But there's a lot, definitely, I don't know if I could get to 50, but there's definitely a lot going on in these wines.
I wouldn't doubt that if you put them in a laboratory and isolated all the various phenols and all of the things that create aromas in wine, that there's at least 50. And then after that, it's individual interpretation and what you can pick up and what somebody else can pick up. But yes, I'm in 100% agree with you. Saffron is a botrytis driven aroma profile. Hey, we have another question. You ready for it?
Yeah. Sure.
So Ken asks, are producers allowed to seed botrytis fungus within their vineyards to encourage noble rot? Now, this is definitely done in the New World.
Yes.
Because it's not naturally occurring. So I've heard of basically going through the vineyard with sprayers and spraying on the mold spores to get it to start growing. One of the California properties that's now very famous for it, at least started their process that way. And I think I've read since then that now it occurs naturally because they've put it in manually for a while and now it's just there. So is that allowed in Bordeaux?
No. No, absolutely. They the old world in general is famous for not allowing things that we would take for granted in New World viticulture and winemaking, and Bordeaux is no different. But yes, all over the New World, you see that. Sort of again, it's not artificial because it's natural, but it's introducing something to the area that wasn't necessarily there before or wouldn't come on its own. But I have had some delicious botrytized wines that were made that way from the New World, from California, Napa. But no, it is not allowed in Bordeaux. Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So with all these aromas and flavors, Ron, I don't think it's surprising to hear that Sauternes, Barsac, the botrytized wines of Bordeaux, sweet botrytized wines of Bordeaux, are famously great with food and a wide variety of foods. So I thought it'd be fun. This is really your forte over mine, is wine and food pairing. I have some pictures of some foods. We can go through them pretty quickly. We don't take people's whole day from them, but some of these are considered to be very classic pairings, and some of these I think are more outside the box pairings. And if you would just comment and tell me why you think it would work or why it wouldn't work. We're picture a classic Sauterne in, with a few years of age, I guess.
I'm gonna open that with, you had found I think you took it out of the presentation, but you had found a top like fast facts on Sauternes, and one of the fast facts on Sauternes that was proffered by wherever you found it was that Sauternes is actually not good with desserts, that it's too sweet for dessert. And I was kind of looking forward to arguing over that, except that it probably would have taken too much time. So I'm just going to say, if you ever read that, that's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard, both experientially and in reality. It just says that the person who wrote that fact doesn't actually like sugar, because sweet beverages with sweet items are a natural pairing. So let's go to what's item number 1.
Blue cheese. So this is a Roquefort, because we're in France. So what do you think with Sauternes blue cheese? Considered to be kind of a classic.
It's absolutely a classic, and I actually prefer sweet white wines with blue cheese over port. I know all of the British people in the world have now rolled over and are throwing darts at me digitally and otherwise, but the reason for that for me is that the extra alcohol in port makes the mold in the cheese more bitter, which if that's what you're really into, then it's probably okay and you probably like it that way, right? But in the case of balancing and creating harmony, I think that the sweetness of the Sauternes balances out the bitterness, and nothing else in the wine promotes it. And then you have salty and sweet together. And then the magic of botrytis affected wines, and this applies beyond Sauternes with blue cheese, is the acid they bring to the party that you don't expect cleanses away the fattiness of the cheese. So yes, this is a great idea. And actually sweet wines with, in addition to blue cheese, but sweet wines with washed rind cheeses are also a little easier to pair than if you're trying to put dry red or white with those highly, let's just say, aromatic and intense wine cheeses are very hard on wine.
Foie gras.
The most classic, no? Okay, so foie gras is considered savory, except that almost every chef puts something sweet on it because it does balance out how intense this is. So why is this magic? This is magic primarily because of texture. Foie gras is almost identical texture. When you put it in your mouth, it kind of melts into this very viscous thing, just like the Sauternes. And texture is a huge issue in food and wine pairing. Then you take the other componentry on the plate, right? The fact that the sauce is usually sugar laden, which needs a little bit of sugar, and then whatever savory element they put underneath it. Like in this case, there's some sort of savory bread or potato looking thing underneath there. All of those things lend themselves really, really well to Sauternes and other botrytis affected wines, but definitely Sauternes. This is probably the one thing that people immediately think together if it's either blue cheese or foie gras.
And point out for those who for whatever reason, ethical or otherwise, would not support the eating of foie gras. The French government has backed a project for lab-grown foie gras that is they are very excited about. And supposedly, the early results are delicious. Ron, I don't know, I haven't tried it yet.
Fascinating. Well,
we'll see.
We'll see.
Okay, this is I guess considered classic to some, not to me, but raw oysters, Ron.
Yeah, this one I'm struggling with, but I did you brought it up earlier, so I put some thought into it, and I can imagine that Sauternes, not the intensity level of Yquem, but that middle ground of intensity without a lot of age, so young and bright and kind of ostentatious, with the larger, more meaty version of oysters, especially some that are more in the warmer weather where they get a little mushy and they're not quite as crisp, and keeping the oyster broth with it, what's in the shell. You got that salty thing, and then if you actually chew the oyster, where you're getting that texture that's not too dissimilar to foie gras, I can see how this could be pleasurable to some people. In my wishes, I want tart, dry, crisp, white wine with this, but I could see it working. I could see it working really well with something like Oysters Rockefeller, where you have the cream addition and the salty and the cheese, or something like that, a little easier. But I'm willing to try it once and find out I was wrong, or that the magic is something other than I expected. Not on my top 10 attempts, though.
This is a suggestion from the Sauternes website itself: butternut squash soup.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a possibility for Sauternes with soup. I also think that when you go down to the idea of lobster or shrimp bisque, you're in the same realm. You're dealing with a soup that has a lot of texture. So this butternut squash needs to be really close to just pureed butternut squash, right? You don't want it to be thinned out, because you need to compete with the texture of the wine. And the other thing is that the sugar mimics a little bit of warmth on your palate. So two magic points about making this work: the soup cannot be served hot. It has to be served at just barely, like, warm. Because if you have cold Sauternes and hot soup, then there's just a problem in the conflict there. But yes, I have often served sweet wines with pureed vegetable soups, and they work quite well, especially butternut squash. I actually, my favorite pairing at a restaurant I used to work at was all sauce Vendange Tardive Pinot Gris and butternut squash soup. So yeah, it's totally possible here.
So speaking of lobster bisque, what about lobster itself? Here we have a grilled lobster tail. What do you think about that with
I think that it depends on what you do to the lobster. The lobster in and of itself, I think, is prime for a pairing with Sauternes, because it is a very meaty, toothsome sort of thing, and it's not got an entirely large personality on its own. It's the meat itself isn't overly flavorful, but the things that come to mind for me are things like a little bit more intensity of flavor, like lobster thermidor, grilled perhaps. But I think it's really about what you dress it with. If you're just simply going to take it and dunk it in clarified butter, it's probably not going to work very well. But if you can juice it up a little bit, maybe there's something creamy added to it, or at least more flavor, I think you got a pretty good shot at that. Maybe you cover it, maybe you add to it like a sauce that's basically a thinned out bisque, something like that.
I tried to find a picture, Ron, because I'll tell you what makes me nervous in this picture is the lemon. I tried to find a picture of grilled lobster without lemon, and they don't exist apparently. But
yeah,
would you forego squeezing the lemon if you were going to have the Sauternes? Would that throw it off?
I probably would at first, and then see what happens, because that's a pretty big shock of lemon juice. I think the Sauternes will absorb it perfectly well, because there's so much sugar to cover it up. But I think it would have the potential of alienating the wine if you're not careful. There's a question jumping in here. TJ, at what temperature should you serve Sauternes?
For me, it's not. It's between red wine and white wine. Cool, but not cold. You want that richness. You want that those aromatics to come out, but you don't want it to be certainly room temperature, because then it's not as refreshing. Would that jive with you, Ron?
Yeah, it works for me. I like the idea of targeting 50 degrees. If you pull it out of the refrigerator, it's a little less impressive. And I also think it's about application. If you were going to serve Sauternes with that butternut squash soup, you'd probably want it to be served cellar temperature, about 55. But if you're serving it with, a chilled style dessert, like a peach tart or something like that, then you could serve it colder with that.
Would it change too, Ron? I was just thinking about this, the age of the wine. If it's younger, maybe you want it a little bit cooler, and as it ages, maybe it can come up a few degrees in temperature.
Completely agree. Older Sauternes, you don't want to hide any of the aromatics by cooling it down too much. So, low cellar temperature in between that 50, 55 realm. And I've, because I was working in a restaurant and somebody else was drinking the Sauternes and wanted to share it with me, and I had to set it on a shelf and walk away, I've had it at room temperature with age, and it's beautiful. So it just depends on what you're trying to do with it. What's next?
So I read that Sauternes can be very friendly with a lot of Asian spices. So here we have something called, it's Vietnamese inspired lacquered pork belly.
I think you're going to win with a lot of Asian style recipes, because most Asian recipes, if they're a sauce driven, they have some aromatic heat, and a fair amount of sugar. All of their barbecue sauces, in quotations, tend to have some sort of sugar base to them. This one does too. And so you need sugar to compete with that. And there's certainly enough flavor going on here to compete with the intensity of the Sauternes. One word of caution, even with the sugar to help cover up aromatic heat, you have to be super careful because Sauternes still has 12.5 to 14% alcohol in the wine. And the aromatic heat will latch onto that and make you and dial it up to where your 13% alcohol wine feels like 15% because of the spice. So all of these things are relative. I would stay low on the spice, but yes, the salty, umami, sweet twinges of Asian cuisine, absolutely, that would be great together, just like they're great with Riesling.
And we have another dish, mango. It's generally mango is good with, because I can see that you remember some of the flavors in Sauternes, but this is a Thai dish, a mango curry duck. So we're dialing up the spice quite a bit here.
Yeah, it's mango red curry, looks like too.
Yes.
So again, I make red curry dishes here at the house that work with wine, but I dial down the overall heat package, right? So if this is the 4 chili pepper curry on the menu, no, it's not going to work. If it's the 2 chili pepper sign on the Thai menu, it could work. It would work pretty well because you're going to water down the spice with your addition of rice. And again, I think that the intensity level comparison is great because Sauternes in its nature young, by the way, this would be something I would do with young Sauternes. I wouldn't put any aged Sauternes here. You need something to compete with it, and this will certainly do that. Stay away from heat.
So some sweeter pairings, very classic pairing, I believe, in France is just a simple fruit tart. It could be an apple. Here we have an apricot tart.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think apricots and peaches are exceptionally well suited to Sauternes because it carries a lot of those flavors with them. I like the not sweet crust with it because it gives you a break from the Sauternes. So I think that's where the facts about Sauternes was heading is if you put sweet with sweet, it just is too much sweet. And from a European perspective, that's probably accurate because they tend to make less sweet desserts than we make in the US, which, you know, the more grams of sugar per square inch, the better in our desserts, but not so much in Europe. But you can amp it up. Like Sauternes and creme brulee is delicious together, and that's a lot of sugar per square inch. So,
strawberries and cream was mentioned several times as a very classic pairing with Sauternes.
Yeah. As opposed to, you know, the strawberries and cream in Wimbledon and champagne, right? If you're going to do strawberries and cream and champagne as an aside, get a demi-sec champagne.
Yes,
because you're not going to like that with dry champagne. But the idea here, I would definitely want a lighter weight Sauternes if I was just going to have strawberries and cream with it and expect it to be a magical moment, like maybe the Emotion that we saw earlier, this would be a good option for. But if you're talking about an aged and classic and fully botrytized Sauternes, this is not got enough weight. It really won't pair. It'll just get washed away.
You mentioned creme brulee. So creme brulee and panna cotta, this is a panna cotta, came up several times and with some sort of not exotic, but more tropical fruit like mango, or in this case, passion fruit.
Yep. Really just going to depend. Most panna cotta is very delicate and not overly sweet. And so for me, this dish looks like Moscato d'Asti is the magic pairing here, where it's not as sweet and it's got a little effervescence to lighten it up. I think this dish is probably a little too lightweight for traditional Sauternes, but if you had one of the lesser wines that didn't have as much botrytis and isn't, you know, 160 grams per liter, but more like, you know, 100 or something like that, it'd probably work, but this is not ideal. I don't think there's enough texture or enough sugar here.
I read one person's most magical Sauternes pairing was Château Coutet and roasted pineapple. I have never had a roasted pineapple, but I can imagine it.
We do grilled pineapple here at the house a lot, and it's amazing how much sweeter it gets even just grilling it for a few minutes. So I can imagine that if you took a fully ripe, naturally fully ripe pineapple and you roasted it with this glaze that looks like this right here, it probably would be magic with Sauternes, especially if it was on some sort of sweet brioche or something to sort of give you some texture. It will be lighter than the wine, but that's okay. The key with sweet things is the wine should be sweeter than your food. And I don't think that's a problem here, and looks pretty natural.
Rhubarb came up quite a bit, and this is like just a rhubarb crumble.
It's going to depend on how much sugar you put in your rhubarb, because now you're talking about sort of diametrically opposed flavors, red, slightly bitter fruits against white, sweet, and orange fruits. The crumble is going to have a lot to do with it. If it's got a good dose of cinnamon and brown sugar in the crumble, that'll help a ton. And last but not least, if you dollop on top of it some nice sweetened cream, not ice cream, because ice cream's too cold for Sauternes, but good sweetened cream where you're adding that vanilla and sweet fat note on top, I think you would do just fine here. But again, not the big intense aged version. I think your best choice with older, like this is going to be an experience in Sauternes wines, is to either just to have it for dessert on its own, or offer it with some more neutral cheeses, not quite as intense maybe as blue cheese perhaps, but, or something like that where it can really shine.
This is somewhat controversial, I think, Sauternes and chocolate, but this is, we talked about this a little bit offline, and so I picked, you can't tell as much here, but this is a milk chocolate mousse.
Okay. I think you've got a shot here because it's milk chocolate. Chocolate is a really difficult wine pairing because it has so much personality and intensity on its own. Port usually works out with chocolate fairly well. In the case of sweet white wines, including Sauternes, if you take milk chocolate and combine it with tropical fruit flavors, bananas, orange, tangerine, pineapple, that sort of thing, you will win almost every time. But just chocolate on its own is a little difficult. So, you know, this has a chance. It won't be a 10 out of 10. It'll probably be a 5.5 maybe. But if you took and mixed that milk chocolate mousse with the addition of some sort of tropical fruit nuance, maybe even bring in that passion fruit we saw a few minutes ago. I've seen people do that with milk chocolate. You might have a 10 out of 10 eventually. And bananas and chocolate are great, and bananas and Sauternes are great. So, you know, let's use it to our advantage.
Well, that was fun. It made me hungry as always. Right before lunch. So
do that to yourself just so you can go eat lunch.
Just some other chateau to be aware of in Sauternes Barsac. Again, there's a lot of them, but these are some of the ones that that I personally have tried and loved. So go check those out. And thank you, Ron, for sharing your wine and food pairing wisdom, as always.
Of course.
There's SauternesBarsac.com. Not an amazingly informational website, but there's some good stuff and some really good visuals. And thanks, as always, to Jeff Levy at the WineCellarInsider.com for fantastic information, and Bordeaux.com. And we will see you in a couple of weeks. We're going to tackle our last family of the 6 families of Bordeaux wines. We're going to Entre deux Mers, so the land of white wine. Will be fun and perfect for the warm days in August.
Sounds fabulous.
Further comments, questions from anyone?
No, I think we have exhausted the questions, and I think everybody's decided it's time for lunch.
Yes, it is. I am very hungry myself. Unfortunately, I don't have any of those things on hand. So, out of luck. All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, you can check out past episodes on our YouTube channel, Winebow. And that's it. Thanks very much. And we'll see you next time.